Chapter 69. The Law for All the World. One of the strange arguments of antinomians and of other critics of theonomy is that God's law was only intended for the Hebrews, and that, with the Christian era, it is now no longer valid. But God, the Creator, is Lord over all things and over all men and nations. All through the Bible, He holds all men and nations accountable to Him in terms of His lordship and law. When Isaiah gives us an account of God's coming judgment on the nations, it is because He is the Lord over and lawgiver to all. The same is true of the book of Revelation. But this is not all. We find evidences of God's law in all parts of the world. This does not mean laws against murder and theft, for example. On pragmatic terms, we would expect most, if not all, societies to have such legislation. In one ancient Aztec manuscript from before the coming of Cortés, we find that the root for God in the Nahuatl language, Teo, is similar to the Latin Deus. Restitution was the law, but a traveller could satisfy his hunger by taking a few ears of corn from the edge of a field by the roadside. For married women, the penalty for adultery was death. In our time, in the jungles of Burma, Don Richardson found Dayaks have their scapegoat in a ceremony similar to the biblical scapegoat. The Yali cannibals of central New Guinea have their places of refuge, similar to the biblical cities of refuge. A similar law existed in pre-Christian Hawaii. Such examples can be multiplied. How or when these laws of God were transmitted to remote cultures we cannot say, but their presence is very clear. God somehow had His law dispensed to the peoples of all the earth. Certainly, we find accounts, very exaggerated and warped, of Genesis chapters 1 to 11 in all parts of the globe. We are told in Matthew 25:32 that, quote, before Him, end quote, the Son of Man, quote, shall be gathered all nations, end quote, and the assumption in what follows is that all nations know the Lord's law. They know it first because, as Romans 1:18-21 tells us, God's wrath is upon them because His law was written in every atom of their being, but they held it down in their unrighteousness or injustice. Second, we cannot assume that Jonah was the only prophet to other nations. Jesus spoke of the zeal of the Pharisees to convert foreigners, Matthew 23:15, and Solomon, in dedicating the temple, prayed that foreign converts could have their prayers especially answered by God, 1 Kings 8:41-43. The converts from among the nations were many. Psalm 87 celebrates the processions of foreigners to Jerusalem and the temple. In our Lord's time on earth, the court of Gentiles was evidence of the many foreign believers. God, as the Creator of all things, is Lord over all men and nations. The fact that He chose one people, the Hebrews, descendants of Abraham and his household, does not mean a disregard for other nations. Very early, God tells Abram, quote, in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed, end quote, Genesis 12:3. The word translated as family means tribe, family, people, or nation. God has Abraham in mind as the messenger or teacher of all the families on the face of the earth. To assume that God had only the Hebrews in mind is comparable to saying that because the Reverend John Jones is called to the pastorate of a church, he alone will be saved. The focal point in God's calling of Abraham is not simply Abraham nor Israel, but the whole world, all men, all nations, tribes, and tongues. As Kenneth L. Gentry Jr. has noted, quote, people from all nations are under obligation to God's law today, end quote. As Gentry rightly points out, Paul in Romans 1:32 applies the law of God to all peoples without exception. Those who limit God's law to the Hebrews are as foolish as the ancient Syrians who said, speaking of Israel's God, the Lord is God of the hills, but He is not God of the valleys, 1 Kings 20:28, and who therefore decided to war against Israel in the valleys. Our sophisticated critics have not yet learned that the God of the Bible is Lord over all things. His law is therefore a universal law. The greatness of the biblical God is his total relevance, whereas the evil of false belief is that it limits God to quote-unquote spiritual concerns. Some years ago, Eugene Aida called attention to the fact that, in some parts of the world, being Christian was identified with very practical concerns. Thus, in one area of Liberia, if a man were asked if he were a Christian and he was not, his answer was, quote, "No, I don't boil water," end quote, because boiling water, purifying it, was seen as a symbol of Christianity, that is, a thoroughly practical matter. In the Cameroon, a man asked if he were a Christian would answer, "Certainly, can't I read?" To limit the relevance of Christianity to quote-unquote spiritual concerns is to deny the faith